Well, hello and welcome to the ideology chapter. Congratulations, you survived the first exam in this class, so that's very exciting. Let me just take a minute to explain a little bit of what's happening in the next unit of the class. The first unit was all about how the government works. So if this is sort of a little here, we can say government. And we talked all about the Constitution, the three branches of the government, and how it works. Well, the second part of the class, we're going to be talking about stuff that's happening over here, which is the people are over here, people, and then we're going to be telling the government what we want. So the first part of the class was all about the government, and the second is all about the people and how we communicate our desires to the government. And there's a fancy word we use to explain how we communicate these things. We call it linkage institutions. Okay, so things like our ideology, which is what our beliefs about politics are, our public opinion. We are going to communicate our ideology, our public opinion to the government. And that's what this unit's all about. So we're talking about voting and interest groups and political parties and a little bit about money in politics. And this is all about how we communicate what we want to the government so our democracy can fulfill its goal of acting out the will of the people. How is it supposed to know what to do if we don't tell it what to do? Okay, so now we're talking about ideology, which is a tremendously important topic. I hope that you've had time to look at chapter 5. Ideology is one of those things that I feel like is never really taught in school, but it's something that really defines American political decision making. So how are we supposed to know how to make decisions if we don't know what our own ideology is? So I just want to let you know that the definition of ideology is that ideology is a coherent set of beliefs. Okay? Basically, think of your belief set as like a tree. And like there might be some things that are real basic that you know to be true and you really believe them. That's like the trunk of the tree here. And then every decision you make after that is shaped by the trunk. So the branches grow from the original belief system. That's very important because political beliefs are just beliefs. If they are going to make sense, they have to be coherent. So I'll come back to this thought in just a minute. As part of your homework, one of the things I want you to do is to go to the World's Smallest Political Quiz, and there's a link to this on the blackboard, or if you just Google World's Smallest Political Quiz, you'll totally see it. And you will be asked a series of questions, and only 10. It's a very simple quiz, and it'll tell you where you fall, where your ideology falls. So there are two different dimensions on this scale. One is conservative to liberal, which is the most common thing that we'll talk about, and then the other is libertarian to statist. So libertarian is basically another way to say that you hate government so much that you basically would be fine with no government. Okay? If you're statist, you kind of are very comfortable with government. You like the government telling you what to do, so you're very comfortable with big government. So I want you to go to this quiz and answer the questions, and that's going to be part of your homework, just to report whether or not you think the quiz really reflected accurately your political beliefs. Okay, so another thing I want to say, which isn't going to make a lot of sense, is that most Americans are not ideological. So here's our first slide again. If we drew a perfect bell curve of the distribution of public opinion in America, and this is the middle, like half of people are on one side and half are on the other. Let's say over here we're going to have Republicans. Over here we're going to have Democrats. And the Republicans are otherwise known as conservative. Democrats are generally liberal. If we were going to see how much of the population had political beliefs that were very true to being either conservative or liberal, we would find that only about 10% of Americans are ideological. Meaning, if we ask them a series of questions about beliefs, only about 5% would fall over here, and only about 5% would fall over here, for a total of 10%. So now I'm sure you're thinking, if only 10% of Americans are ideological, why are we talking about this? Well, if you think about who it is who's ideological in this country, it's all of our political leaders. So ideology is shaping the choices that are set before us by these ideological people. Most folks are in this area, this moderate range, and maybe a lot of you have this feeling too. You don't mind voting for Democrat or Republican. You want to vote for the candidate. You're more of an independent. But the thing is, the choices that are placed before us are decided by the folks who are conservative or liberal. So it's really important to understand what the choices are about. Okay, so moving on. The major ideologies in America are being a liberal or being a conservative, and I hope that you know by now that I'm not going to try to convince you to be either way. This is my job here is to help you understand what the ideas are behind both of these schools of thought. Typically, Democrats are liberal and Republicans are conservative. Now, that's immediately confusing to people in Oklahoma because, as you probably know, about 70% of Oklahomans are Democrats, yet they mainly say they're Republican. So how does that work? Basically, in Oklahoma, people are generally conservative, yet they register Democratic. So that's why people in Oklahoma find this pretty confusing. There are other ideologies that shape people's political beliefs, for example, feminism or Marxism. So if one is a feminist, that means that asking the question about how a policy affects women will come into every single decision. Like, should the United States go to war in Syria? Well, how would it affect women? Should America increase unemployment insurance? Well, how would it affect women? That's the kind of thing you would do if you were a feminist. Your ideology would kick in every time you considered a new political question. Probably the most relevant political movement in America right now regarding ideology is the Tea Party movement. And the Tea Party movement is particularly relevant because it's an extremely libertarian movement, meaning it's very skeptical of government, especially because they think that too much money is being spent on government as it is. So TEA, the Tea Party, actually stands for tax inequity. And they're basically saying anything that comes down the pike that causes the United States either to not pay down its national debt or go into more debt is just no. Whatever it is, just no. And this is a Scott Brown, who is a Republican who got elected in Massachusetts, and he's an example of how strong the Tea Party movement was, especially 2 years ago. Edward Kennedy, who, for those of you who know a lot about politics, the Kennedy name, you should know, is like the big Democratic name of the century. Well, Scott Brown got elected as a Republican when Edward Kennedy died because he was part of this Tea Party movement, and people were so sick of what they considered liberal spending that they were hungry for an alternative, and that turned out to be Scott Brown. So there's a huge movement afoot to back on big government, so to speak. So the Tea Party movement as an ideological movement is very interesting. So some of you are probably wondering why I'm not talking about the 99%ers. Well, the reason I can't really talk about them is they won't really say what they stand for other than they want good policies for the 99%. It's a little hard to say they're an awesome example of ideology if they won't even say what their ideology is. So this is a good example. All right. So there are 4 questions that I want you to consider. And I'm going to answer them first for what liberals believe and then second for what conservatives believe. The first is the government. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Liberals believe that government is good. They believe that people are good. They believe government's good. They believe government is a good solver of problems. So if there's an issue like low employment, liberals would say, well, there should be a government program for this. Let's fix this. Or if there's a financial crisis, liberals would say, okay, the government can go in and fix this. Liberals see government as the answer to almost anything, okay, because they trust the government and they think it's good. The next question. What is the role of government in regulating morality? Liberals say, and they quote theorists like John Stuart Mill that people have the right to be let alone. If you're not hurting anyone else, then it shouldn't matter what you do in your own home. And some liberals would even say, consensual sex or the use of drugs or living their life in an unconventional manner, like being a nudist or something like that. As long as you're not hurting anyone else, then you should have the right to be left alone, and the government shouldn't come into your house or into your bedroom and try to regulate what you're doing in there. Okay. Third, who provides society's safety net? So, as I'll discuss at length later, we obviously live in a capitalist country, and going to make it and become filthy rich, and some people are going to end up falling through the cracks and not being able to support themselves. We know that this is going to be true. For one thing, unemployment in the United States has never been lower than about 2%, no matter how good the economy is. Okay, so we've got 2% of 300 million Americans out of work who are looking for jobs. Like, what, we got to let them starve? I mean, what do we do? Liberals would say the duty to provide the safety net comes to the government. So liberals support programs like workers' compensation for workers who are injured, unemployment insurance for workers who are laid off of their jobs. They'd support things like Social Security insurance for orphans or widows who can't support themselves. So basically, when it comes to providing the safety net, liberals look to the government to do that. Okay, the fourth and final question is the purpose of government, and the answer is that government is good at solving collective action dilemmas. Now, that's fancy talk, I know, but when I say collective action dilemmas, think about the free rider problem. The reason that we have government, according to liberals, is to solve the free rider problem so that government can continue to provide the goods that we all want them to provide, such as hospitals or roads or a banking system that works, or a system of law enforcement that we can depend on. So basically, liberals are there to help people cooperate because people don't cooperate very well, and to end the free rider problem so that we can continue to support the programs that we really like. So this is what a liberal would say. And this is very simplistic, I know, but it's some of the basic ideas that people depend on. Conservatism is sort of the opposite on many of these questions. If you ask conservatives if government's good or bad, they'd be more likely to say it's bad, although probably they would say more like it's a necessary evil. Like, we don't like it, we don't think it's very good at anything, but we realize that we need to have it, so it's a necessary evil. There's a quote from Ronald Reagan where he says that a conservative says that the 11 greatest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Well, that's scary because if you're a conservative, you don't trust the government to do a good job. You think it's inept. And you would rather have the private market solve issues and not turn to the government every time. Secondly, government must regulate moral issues. So liberals say people have the right to live alone. Conservatives say government must regulate moral issues. Whereas a liberal would say that they can do whatever they want if it's not hurting anyone, conservatives are more likely to believe that immoral acts within a society hurt everyone. It degrades the morality of society. So, for example, if a woman gets an abortion, and if conservatives think that's an immoral act, I mean, they would like the government to step in and say that abortion is illegal. Or gay marriage, for example. Conservatives would want gay marriage to stay illegal because they consider homosexuality immoral. So they believe that government has the power and must regulate moral issues. Number 3, looking at the safety net issue, when it comes to the unemployed or people falling through the cracks, conservatives would turn to a private enterprise solution. Believe that if the government swoops in every time and saves people when they don't have a job, for example, then they'll never have any incentive to get a job. The minimum wage is a good example. Conservatives are usually against the minimum wage because, you know, here's your worker, and you're like, oh boy, I'm going to help this worker. Give him a minimum wage. Well, you've tinkered with the market now, and the price for whatever that person is producing has now increased. And so labor costs are factored in, and pretty soon the price of goods is higher. And then you need another minimum wage increase. So conservatives would say with a situation like this, forget the minimum wage increase, just let the market do its work. The market will provide the incentives needed to urge people to work. And if people do charity, it should be from private charities like churches or from people's families. Keep the government out of it. And finally, the conservatives would agree that government's necessary, but they would say that the reason we have it is to coerce people to be good. Conservatives tend to have a more negative view of human nature, and they know people are going to break the law, and we need someone to deal with lawbreakers. So they would say that the reason we have government is to coerce people to be good and to punish them when they're bad. So in the homework, I asked you about the 4 questions, and this is basically what I just covered. How is the government viewed? What is the role of government in moral issues? Who provides a safety net? And why is the government necessary? And looking at liberals and conservatives, what's the difference in the answer to 4 questions? And of course, here's a picture of President Obama. He's obviously an example of a liberal, and then President Bush is a good example of a conservative. So that's how you're going to do your homework, is refer to these 4 questions. And another great example of a conservative is Ronald Reagan, who many conservatives point to as like the thinking leader of the movement. He said basically that government was not part of the solution, it's part of the problem. And conservatives and libertarians today use things like this that Reagan said as a rallying cry to try to roll back the intrusion of government into American life. So let's just walk through a really quick example here, looking at the difference between liberals and conservatives. Came up a few years ago in Congress, whether or not the Congress should extend prescription drug benefits to senior citizens. Okay, so if you want to compare what liberals and conservatives would think, liberals would probably say yes. Why? Because it's a safety net issue. Liberals say yes, it's a safety net issue. This is something that senior citizens need, and the government should step in and take care of it. Conservatives, if they're going by what I said earlier, they would more likely say no. The government shouldn't provide prescriptions to senior citizens because the safety net should be left in the private market, and that's how these issues should be solved. Okay, next is a question about contraceptives use, and this is pretty relevant because Obama in his health care bill recently went through a debate with Catholic churches about whether they had to provide contraceptives to employees. And you may or may not know, but Catholics are against contraceptives. And so now we have Catholic employers being forced by the government to provide Catholic contraceptives. And the president finally reversed his decision and said they would not have to. But anyway, should the government ban the use of contraceptives? Liberals would say, going back to the regulation of morality, liberals would say no, government should not ban the use of contraceptives because the should stay out of moral issues. Conservatives would be more likely to say yes, if they believe that contraceptives are immoral, then they would expect government to ban their use. Is there a contradiction in these positions? I hope that you see now that sometimes liberals want involvement of government and sometimes conservatives. Sometimes liberals don't and sometimes conservatives don't. I hope that you see that there's this contradiction because many people believe that conservatives think there's never a role for government and liberals always love government, and that's just not true. The way we can break this down is that when we're looking at public issues like things about the workplace, the economic sphere, what goes on at work and school, then liberals are much happier with the role for government. But when it comes to the private sphere, the home or moral issues, then liberals think that people should be left alone in their role for government. So if you think about this, there's a contradiction because liberals are saying, yes, there should be government in the public sphere, but not in the private sphere. Conservatives say, no, there shouldn't be government in the public sphere, but yes, in the private sphere. And so I point this out because it's a real interesting contradiction, and it can help explain some of the things that have been going on, especially in the Republican. If you think about the kinds of conservatives we have running for president right now, I would say Mitt Romney is a good example of a public sphere fiscal conservative, because he doesn't like government interaction in the public sphere, in the workplace, etc. And then candidate Santorum really seems like a great example of more of a social conservative, where that's where his most important policy is with his other Republican challengers are. So Romney is a good example of a fiscal conservative. Santorum's more of a social conservative. I don't know about Newt Gingrich. I don't know. I mean, I hear him talk, and he says we're going to build a colony on the moon and all kinds of stuff. I mean, he almost sounds like a public sphere liberal. I'm not really sure. And then Ron Paul is a great example of a libertarian, because you ask him about what the proper role for government is, and he basically says no government. I mean, as little as possible. Get rid of the Federal Reserve, get rid of all the safety net, roll back the 14th Amendment all the way back to the 1860s. So we're really seeing a very interesting conflict between these different kinds of conservatives. Okay, so let me go back in deep history here for just a second, if you'll indulge me. The ideas, these historical ideas, started coming about in the 1600s during a period called the Great Enlightenment. And classical liberalism really started about the 1600s. And this guy, John Locke, believed, and many other thinkers believed, that people, if put right government, would get better and better every day. In your textbook, on the first page, I talk about Aristotle. Aristotle is a political theorist, and he basically believed that if you built the perfect government, people would get better and better. So if you live in America with our awesome government, but if you live in North Korea with its weirdo government, then you will actually degrade as a human being. That's what liberals believe, that people can actually get better because the government is superior or inferior. But classical liberals also believed you wanted to have a minimal government, not really big. They believed that the government that governs least governs best. So the classical liberals didn't want a huge government. They just wanted little rules and little nudges that kept people on the right track. Okay, so in contrast to the classical liberals, we have classical conservatism. And this guy, Edmund Burke, another Britishman, one of his ideas was actually called the Burkean trustee. You should be thinking about your Congress homework here, because I really believe that government officials needed to represent the people, because the people were so dumb and ridiculous that they shouldn't have a direct say in government. He thought there was a natural ruling class that should be in charge of folks, and then most of the rest of us should just stay out of it. And he didn't even want people to vote. He said basically it's ridiculous to think people are getting better just because of where they live. Society's not progressing, and the human nature isn't going to change from evil to good. Everybody's evil, they're going to stay evil, and they're not going to get better depending on where they live. So I hope you can see a real contrast here between the Locke liberal and the Burkean conservatives. Okay, so in the United States, when these ideas get planted into our United States Constitution, when you think about the Constitution, you should know it's a really very conservative document, because the people who wrote our Constitution, they were conservative. They believed in creating a government that was going to be stable yet insulated from the will of the people. So conservatism was really more evident in the Constitution. Remember, if men were angels, we wouldn't need laws to govern men, basically. They're saying men are not angels. And so the Constitution sets up a government to control the impulses of men. So here we have the Constitution. It lays out conservative ideas. The conservative philosophy grew even stronger throughout the 1850s and into the 1930s during the Industrial Age. I can't do justice to this. I wish I could talk to you, but for 2 weeks on this topic. But two things are at work here during the industrial age. One is the idea of laissez-faire economics, which is basically hands-off economics. So the government is supposed to stay out. It didn't matter if factories were manufacturing meat that was tainted and disgusting and made people sick. Who cares? You were a fool for buying it. It didn't matter if you go to work at a factory and it cuts your arm off. Well, like, you're just a dummy for getting your arm cut off, and you're going to get fired because you don't have an arm now. Basically, the government stayed away from regulating business in any form. And there was a feeling of social Darwinism, which was made famous by this guy, Herbert Spencer. He believed that basically, if you could make it to the top, it was like Darwinism in the natural world. It was survival of the fittest. And if you could make it to the top, you were worthy. And if you got kicked out and got killed at the bottom, then you were not worthy. So there's this feeling that if you make it in this rough and tumble world, then you were really something. You were really worth it. And if you failed, it was because of your own fault. So during the industrial age, it was the strongest we had of this naked conservative thinking. All right. During the industrial age, which basically spans from 1850 to 1930, there were two little pockets of liberalism. And I'm going to point to these are words you hear a lot today, even. The first is populism, which means power to the people. When they talk about the 99% movement right now, they might say it's a populist movement because the people are trying to take power into their own hands. So during the populist movement, there was a little surge of liberalism that pushed for more power to the people. They believed the government was tyrannical and it was out of control, and the people needed to stand up. During the 1920s, well, it actually started in the 1880s, but culminated in the 20s, another liberal movement called progressivism sprang up, and progressivists believed we had a need for social and economic reform, but it had to come at the hands of the government because the government was the only thing strong enough to stand up to these really powerful business interests. People couldn't do it alone. They needed to have a government stand up and compete against, like, the railroads, for example. So to illustrate, those of you from Oklahoma might appreciate this. Kate Barnard was a woman who was a political figure in Oklahoma, and she was actually elected to be the first woman serving in state government in Oklahoma in 1907 when we became a state. She started out her political career as a populist. So here she is, she's in Oklahoma City, the land run has happened. Oklahoma City has grown from like almost no people to 100,000 people overnight because of the land run. Now it's a big campsite with 100,000 people in it. Substandard housing, no sanitation, which means there's poo everywhere. The streets weren't regulated, like street lights and muddy stuff everywhere. People were getting sick. I mean, it was just a bad situation. So she decided she was a little do-gooder lady. So she would organize drives and she would try to feed the needy and stuff like that. And then she realized, how is this group of people going to take on a problem like sanitation in a city of 100,000? She realized that if she was really going to make a difference, she needed to get the government to do stuff. So she pushed the state of Oklahoma government to do more in areas like corrections and charities, sanitation, cleanliness. She tried to ban liquor. She just had all these ideas for how the government should step in and be the force for good that she desired. So that's an example of someone who started out as a populist and became a progressive. You still hear people talking about populist leaders all the time. Okay, so America's rolling along. 1930s, you should know, is the time of the Great Depression. In 1929, we had a terrible crisis in the United States. We have stock market crash. We have drought in states like Oklahoma. And we have farmers losing their land. We have people losing their jobs, 25% unemployment in the United States. Okay, so there was a Republican conservative in the White House at this time. And during the Great Depression, he did very little. The federal government did very little to respond to the Great Depression. And you're thinking, is this good, is this bad? He acted exactly how a conservative should have acted in 1929. We'd never had a federal government ever respond to financial crisis in the United States. Now, Herbert Hoover, who was the president, he was not a bad man. He did exactly what his ideology told him, which is nothing. So when the race for president for the presidency in 1932 came around, Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran, and he ran on a revolutionary platform that the government was going to step in and solve these problems, solve the problem of homelessness, of lack of jobs, of banks failing. The president, was going to fix all this. Well, of course, and people were desperate. They vote for Roosevelt in 1932. He becomes president in 1933, and Congress passes all of his legislation, and he solves all of these problems. So that changed ideology in America, totally changed ideology in America. So the date 1932 is pretty critical. That's when America really switched from being guided by conservative principles to being guided by liberal principles. Okay, so this is Roosevelt over here. And then Kennedy became president in 1960, and then he was assassinated in 1963. And when he died, the presidency was taken over by Lyndon Johnson in 1963. And he had this huge plan. He had a plan called the Great Society, and he was going to end racism and end poverty in America. He could have seen what Roosevelt did and then taken a step back. But do you see how a platform of ending poverty and ending racism actually increases the size of the government? Ending poverty and racism is no easy thing to do, for sure. So he made all these pledges and all these promises. Of course, he didn't actually accomplish them. I wish he had, but as it turns out, it's a little hard to end poverty in a capitalistic country. It's a little hard to end racism anywhere. 1932. Sounds like a pretty important year to me. Okay, so here we're moving into the 1980s. The liberal welfare state, the growth of government got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then finally there was this big backlash. People were very discontented with having big and expensive government. So Ronald Reagan gets elected president in 1980, and it's sort of a conservative revolution where he's going to roll back the government. He's going to make it as small as possible. So Reagan is of this contemporary conservative feeling. So is George W. Bush. It was seen as a backlash from the New Deal. And some of the ideas that are being pushed by the little more conservative contemporary movement is individual responsibility, take that safety net away because it's reducing people's incentive to work, put power back at the state level, reduce the power of the federal government, use government to promote good morality, and stop things like free sex and gay people and abortions and all that. The government needs to get in there and try to solve these issues. And then a fourth thing is to roll back what they believe to be the unnecessary liberties interpreted by the liberal Warren Court. And I'll go into that more when we get to civil rights and liberties. But there's this very specific agenda being pursued by the conservative movement. Okay, so currently the real struggle between conservatives like George W. Bush and liberals like Obama. So it seems like liberalism was sort of struggling on the decline. It seems like all the fresh new ideas are more on the conservative side. So it's hard to know if we're going to see like a rise of either liberals or conservatives, or if we're going to have more people in the middle who are more independent who come forward. I mentioned Scott Brown a while ago with the conservative Tea Party movement, who's more of a libertarian. And this is a pretty, this is a movement with a lot of energy behind it to simply roll back all the taxes and the expense of our federal government. So what will happen next? Well, like I said, there are a few options. We've got the option of more of a rise of liberalism, where people are going to follow President Obama and what he's saying. Are we going to see a backlash against Obama, rise of conservatism with the Tea Party and John Boehner kind of leading the way, Sarah Palin, Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum? Are we going to go in that direction? Or are people going to be turned off by extremism and actually work toward the center? If you think back to that original drawing I showed you, where basically most people are not ideological, most people are in the middle parts, here we're going to have a bunch of politicians who are trying to drag them out to the corners. I think the people want to see more of a moderate solution to a lot of America's problems. There's a lot of stuff that people can agree on, but the problem is we got our liberals over here and our conservatives over here, and they have a real hard time getting together and agreeing on anything. So anyway, I hope you learned a little something here, and let me know if you have any questions.